My name is Belinda Kemp and I'm the Senior Scientist in Enology here at CCOVI. I'm pleased to welcome you all to the first lecture in our 2019 CCOVI Lecture Series. We have a wonderful lineup of industry experts scheduled to present this year on topics spanning the entire grape and wine value chain. It is my privilege to introduce CCOVI Fellow Don Cyr this afternoon. Don is a Professor of Finance, a former Dean and former Associate Dean for Graduate Programs and Research in the Goodman School of Business here at Brock University. His research and publications are focused on the potential use of financial weather index contracts for hedging weather-related risks in viticulture, as well as industrial organisation within the wine industry. He is a member of the Editorial Advisory Board of the Journal of Wine Economics and a member of both the American Association of Wine Economics and the Academy of Wine Business Research. His wine and viticulture research has been highlighted in the Globe and Mail, the Canadian Grapes to Wine magazine, Wine Business Monthly, and the Wine Access magazine. Please join me in welcoming Don to the CCOVI Lecture Series today. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Yes, a lot of my research has been on what's called weather index derivatives. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the end in terms of potential application of the technology that is a big part of this paper today, who is the natural heir to Robert Parker in the premier wine market. This is a paper that myself and my two colleagues, Lester Kwong and Ling Sun from the Department of Economics at Brock, have been looking at, and we've taken a couple of steps at this paper, and this is kind of now the final version of it. There has been some intermediary work done before. I'll talk a little bit about the premier process and the impact of wine critic ratings and wine prices, and then I'll talk about the impact of Robert Parker. And Neil Martin, I'll relate some of Parker's ratings to Neil Martin, and then I'll talk about the technology that we're using to examine the relationship between ratings and prices, a paper that we did in 2017, and now we're applying it across different wine raters and their ratings. Talk a bit about the data, and we're going to expand our results and look at a number of wine critics. And the goal here is to try and find a wine critic that would be natural heir to Robert Parker, and talk about what the issue is there, and then I'll do the results and conclusion. So the Bordeaux premier process exists in France for centuries. It's sort of a futures market where before bottling the wine, it is sold in barrel and sold ahead, frequently 8 to 10 months ahead. And there is a benefit, of course, to the purchaser. The purchaser typically secures a vintage before it's bottled and released, and typically at a lower price, consequently. There's also a significant benefit to the producer. They can sell the wine in advance, of course, and there's a cash flow that comes from that. And for the chateau, the uncertainty is, of course, reduced the higher the price in the premier market. So they go into the premier, this futures market, and they're selling the wine, and of course the higher the price. And that's going to be a key issue that we're going to look at, all the better for them. The risk is mitigated. And the prices have been shown to be heavily dependent upon critic barrel scores achieved. So wine critics taste the wine in the barrel and provide their rating score, and then this has been a long history of this. And a very prestigious wine critic, of course, that has had a great influence on Bordeaux wine and the premier market is Robert Parker Jr. And it's been shown that the ranking of, or his rankings appear to have a significant impact, have appeared to have a significant impact upon prices. He's been largely viewed as the authority on Bordeaux premier wines. It's not been without some some controversy as over the years, over a span period of approximately 40 years. Bordeaux wine, he's been criticized as advocating style over substance, and it's resulted in a homogeneous wine, a world of highly oaked and over-extracted wines. However, he was also pushed or credited with having pushed the Bordeaux wine industry into new technology and greater consistency over the years. He's had a significant impact on that industry and on the entrepreneur market. So this paper falls within the context of a number of studies that have looked at the ratings of wine critics and the impact on wine prices. A 2015 paper did sort of a meta-analysis of that over 60 studies, 180 hedonic wine price models over a 20-year period. And the research identifies that the relationship between the price of wine and its sensory quality rating is a moderate partial correlation of 0.3. And we're going to remember that number because we're going to take a look at this problem from a different technology and a different perspective. So what you have there is a partial correlation, a linear-based model of correlations as prices and wine critics ratings, about a correlation of about 0.3. There is also a line of literature that looks at the compares wine critics ratings and their consensus. Here we have that mean reliability between judges is 0.5 across various studies. That's also going to be a number that we're going to remember because we're going to be looking at the correlation between these wine critics ratings in a different way. Taste preferences, of course, and one of the issues when comparing wine critic scores is that different critics have different wine rating scales. That creates some statistical and numerical issues, which the technology we're going to use gladly gets away from. But it is something that you will see in a number of papers in the literature that focus on how to standardize wine critic ratings. And so the first step in this is that the relationship between critics' ratings and wine prices is nonlinear, and a lot of other studies have looked at it from a linear perspective. This study in 2015 notes some nonlinearity in the relationship of Parker ratings and wine prices. And that gives rise to what we call model risk, the fundamental dependence structure between variables and whether it's stationary across the range of the distribution. So generally in these regression analysis, linear correlation is used in many of the studies after adjusting the ratings and being able to manage this issue of different rating scales. One solution, however, is a technology called copula functions that we're going to use here. And what it does is it fits multivariate distributions, incorporating nonlinear dependence. And it's useful for capturing what's called tail dependence, and I'll explain a little bit of that as we go on. In 2017, we had a paper published where we did look at this issue of the relationship of Parker's ratings and the en primeur futures prices. And we noted that, there is a nonlinear relationship that it ends up that this is a simulation of Parker's ratings and price data based upon his actual ratings and prices. And you can see that in this simulation, I'll explain some of these diagrams in a bit more detail later on, you can see a greater correlation in the upper levels of, if this was a variable that was price and this was ratings, you can see that he has higher correlation there than in the middle part of the distribution, the two distributions of price and rating. So there is some non-linearity there. And that you can see more easily captured in terms of how that correlation varies over the range of his ratings, how the correlation between his ratings and prices varies. This is a simulation based upon identified marginal distributions, and you can see how it is non-linear in its nature. And the correlation, there is a little bit of what we would call lower tail dependence at his low ratings, but you can see that the correlation in the middle range of his ratings is relatively low. And the key element, in particular for a producer that says, well, I'd like to, get a high price for my wine. Yes, there's a much higher correlation in his ratings and prices when they're high. So if you get a high rating from him, the chances are that the price of the wine in that futures market is going to be high. If it's not high, the correlation between price and rating is a little less. So this is the nonlinear aspect that is sometimes missed out. So when we talk about the correlation between prices and ratings being 0.3, well, there is a difference across the range of what we call the multivariate distributions. And we're interested in the high prices. So, what we want to know is, where do we find raters wine critics whose ratings are consistent with this sort of behavior of Parker? And the reason why is because in February 2015, after 38 years, Parker announced he would no longer review Bordeaux wine futures, and he turned the responsibility over to Neil Martin, a British wine critic who had started with the Wine Advocate in about 2006. And so in April 2016, Martin assumed responsibility for the review of all Bordeaux wines, both in barrel and bottle, for the Wine Advocate, and Parker stepped away. And when he did, he made a fair amount of clear indication that Neil Martin was his designated individual. He was passing the crown over to Neil Martin. Now, after 38 years, that creates a lot of uncertainty for chateaus that have patterned their wine after the palate of Parker, and has some significant financial risk to it. And then in November 2017, Martin leaves the Wine Advocate to become senior editor for the wine magazine Venus, and Parker then announces that the Wine Advocate's editor-in-chief, Lisa Perotti-Brown, would assume responsibility for the Bordeaux wines. So, after naming Neil Martin, then all of a sudden, Wine Advocate is turning over to Lisa Perotti-Brown. And so in the industry, of course, that has been affected by Parker, this creates a lot of uncertainty. And particularly for Bordeaux, right bank, Moreau-dominated wines, which Parker tended to have a penchant for, so did Neil Martin. So these are the wines that are clearly more affected by Parker's ratings and in terms of price. And so here's just a list of the articles that you'll see that talked about, and embedded in them was discussion of this issue. Well, who is, what's going to happen now? Because Parker is leaving, and what do we do? Because that was really the leader for Bordeaux, in particular the en primeur wine market, this futures market. So let me talk about this technology we're going to use. It's called the modeling things with Copula functions. There's a bunch of math here that I'm not going to bother going into, but Copula functions, based upon the work of Sklar in 1959, said when I have two variables, and I can have more than two as well, but I want to get a real sense of how these two variables behave together, I would like to get the full multivariate distribution. I just don't want to be doing regression or linear correlation. I would like to have a picture, if I have two variables, a 3D picture of the full multivariate distribution so that I know exactly how these variables interrelate across the span of their distributions. So copula functions can be used to express a multivariate distribution in terms of its marginal distributions. And the neat thing about it that Sklar had proven was that if I have two variables, I can identify their marginal distributions, and I can also identify this connector function called a copula. And the process of doing those two things is independent. So I can see what Parker's ratings looks like, what the distribution looks like. I can model that. I can model prices and look at the distribution of that. And then I take those two variables and I convert them into uniform variables that vary from 0 to 1. And I can take that data and I can identify an appropriate copula function that captures the interdependence in a much more sophisticated way. And by doing so, then I can put the data together through a Monte Carlo simulation, and I can get a real good sense about how these things interrelate, how these two variables interrelate. And yeah, so that was that's the idea of copula functions. There is theoretically an infinite number of copula functions that we could have, but there are some standard ones that are used when testing for the interdependence between two variables. And there is the Gaussian student T copula, the Archimedean copulas, and they have simple closed forms which can be managed and which capture some basic independence between two variables. Now, let's take a look at what they look like. So I have two variables, and let's say a wine critic's ratings and wine prices, and I've converted that data to a 0-1 variable in both cases. So here we have two variables. This is what the Gaussian copula would look like. This is a simulation of data that would match a Gaussian copula, that whatever their, regardless of their marginal distributions, this is what this interdependent structure looks like. I'm not showing you the math of the copula function, so they have a functional form. And this is the Gaussian or normal copula. It does not capture, and it's basically looks very much like something that I might get from a linear regression type of model. The student T copula looks like this. So if I find that the data fits this, what it picks up is that it's saying, well, when a variable is low in its value and the other one is high, there seems to be some dependence, and vice versa. Right? So the T is capturing a different type of connection between the two variables, and then from that we can design a three-dimensional multivariate distribution. But its strength is it captures this type of interdependence. Then we have three others that are looked at or used consistently. Clayton copula. What the Clayton copula does is it says, or it captures the relationship between variables where they tend to be more highly correlated when both of them have low values. So this is called lower tail dependence. The Gumbo copula captures, although it captures a little bit of lower tail dependence, its primary function is it can capture the upper tail dependence when both variables have high values. The Frank copula has greater correlation in the middle than in the tail. So that's this one here. That diagram, understanding the relationship that diagram is when you compare it to the normal. You can see how the normal here is spread out much more. And the frank copula is where the data has a higher correlation in the middle. So in copula function model, remember now that what we do is we have two variables. We know what they look like from a distributional, marginal distribution standpoint, but what is the relationship between them? And so the approach is to use maximum likelihood ratio test to see which one fits the data the best. We can also turn the data and flip it around a bit. So we can use, we might find this is a Clayton copula where by inverting the univariate numbers, taking one minus them, I can measure different types of connection between the two variables. In this case, when one is low and the other one is high, it's obviously a correlation, or vice versa over here. And here the Clayton copula, I can turn it around and it will measure upper tail dependence as well. And we're going to see that a lot in the data we're going to look at. We're going to see the Clayton copula up here quite frequently as the best fitting copula to the uniform variance, but an inverted one. It's not a problem, we just, then when we go back to the regular data, we convert that back. Maximum likelihood tests are used. There's different types of those tests, some standard ones, some that correct for how many variables make up the copula function, but in the cases of all of our tests, all three of those measures, the AIC, the BIC, and the HQIC, different statistical tests to look for how well the data fits one of those copulas, they all came out the same. So there was no inconsistency between the results, even though we did, when we get into it, look at this. I'm going to take a little aside here and tell you a little bit about the history of these copula functions and their importance in finance. And the first application started in 1999, but in 2000, this individual wrote a paper on default correlation, a copula function approach, Journal of Fixed Income. And this essentially led, so what I'm going to tell you is the secret behind the 2008 financial crisis and the large economic downturn. And we can blame it on the finance of the mathematics of finance and the copula function. So, and it has a Canadian connection, even though Canadian banks did not suffer from the downturn because they did not get into collateralized debt obligations or mortgage obligations, CMOs, as heavily as other countries did, in particular the US, because of our regulations around banking. But there is a Canadian connection because this individual here wrote this paper, was working for CIBC Bank at the time, wrote that paper, and and you can read an article called "The Recipe for Disaster: The Formula That Killed Wall Street" about this. So here's the issue. Collateralized mortgage obligations. What was happening was that banks would issue mortgages, and then they would sell these mortgages to investment bankers. Investment bankers would take the mortgages and put them into a portfolio. This is called securitization. They would put them together, and then they would sell units to that portfolio. So what they were doing was combining mortgages together in a portfolio. And they would make an argument that there is a diversification effect. That if I take two mortgages and their probability of default is relatively uncorrelated, I can combine them together into a portfolio and I can sell shares, think of shares to that portfolio, these collateralized mortgage obligations. And due to the diversification effect, the low correlation, the risk is lowered overall, and I can sell these things as pretty close to risk-free securities, and yet they seem to have a pretty good return based upon mortgages. And so, of course, everybody was buying. Their argument around the idea of diversification was based upon the normal Gaussian copula. So it was more or less saying that, if I have two mortgages, the probability of both of them defaulting is relatively low. Now, you can imagine now, they, of course, they combine thousands of mortgages together. And when you have more than two variables, when the number of variables increases quite a bit, the Gaussian copula is the easiest one to use mathematically. But the Gaussian copula does not capture tail dependence. It's like linear, sort of like linear correlation. So it would look as if, well, yeah, look now, when we think about the multivariate distribution and the probability of, let's say, two mortgages defaulting, well, it's pretty good, and there's a low probability of that occurring. But, of course, if the housing market tanks, the probability of two mortgages, of defaulting on both mortgages occurring, becomes quite high. The correlation between the probability of default increases substantially when we have this exogenous variable, the housing market going down or the economy going down. And that was the part that resulted in the mispricing of these collateralized mortgage obligations. They looked like pretty risk-free securities. Pension funds bought them, other banks, etc. A lot of them were issued. And of course, the banks, being able to sell these mortgages off to investment bankers, were issuing mortgages that were, had high probability of default. They were not very secure, and they didn't have to worry because they then sold the security to the investment bankers. So you could say, they were out of the picture. So they were promoting, of course, the housing market and the increased mortgages. Investment bankers were taking them, securitizing them, putting them into this portfolio and saying, look, due to diversification, this is low risk, and selling these off. Housing market goes down, and of course these things drop significantly in price. So what should have been used is something like an inverted Clayton or a Gumbel copula that says when the probability of default increases for two unrelated mortgages, the correlation increases as well. So there is a change in the correlation across the range of the distributions. And basically, that's what happened in 2008 financial crisis. Is the same thing happening today? After greater constraints on the securitization of mortgages, investment bankers have been in recent years selling collateralized loan obligations, portfolios of high-risk commercial business loans, not mortgages, they're business loans, and they're risky. They've been using the same argument. The Gaussian copula will put them all into a portfolio and we'll sell these things off. December 18th, this past month, rating agencies sell alarm about leveraged loans and CLOs. And you can see down here the number of CLOs issued in the U.S., how that dropped down 2008-9 to nothing. But over the past few years, it's been increasing substantially. So they've been selling these. So the message here is copula functions might again create another economic downturn. Or if the economy turns down and these commercial, what's the probability of these commercial loans defaulting? Well, it increases, but at the same time, the correlation increases. So that makes these securities much riskier than what they are perceived to be using the mathematics of the Gaussian copula. So let's go to our issue. So we have a database of en primeur prices, wine critics, 2004 on to current. So we can take a look at that data. And there's two periods of study we're going to look at. 2004 through 2010, Parker, of course, was rating wines, but also 2010 to 2012, in that time period as well, both Neil Martin and Parker rated many of the same wines, independent. So we do know that Parker has an effect on prices. Now, he's out of the picture. So who is, if, you know, the market, both consumers and producers say, well, who would be like Parker? So we want to take a look at the ratings of Parker's ratings versus other raters. So the period of 2010-12, in advance of Parker stepping aside, Neil Martin was rating alongside Parker, but independently, these wines. So we have some data there that we can take a look at. So here's 2010 to 2012, and we've got the left bank and the right bank here, just for comparison. And what we've got here in this table, the number of wines that were both ranked by Parker and Martin, and the best fitting copula function that describes that relationship. So the normal or Gaussian, the case of 2010. This is the Spearman's rank correlation. So, you know, but not a lot of tail dependence, because that Gaussian copula says, given the Gaussian copula was the best fitting copula, it's saying there's no tail dependence there. It's just sort of a linear correlation. And we're interested in upper tail dependence because it's the high price, it's the high ratings, and the high prices of Parker that are the issue, because we know that's when the prices are more highly correlated. 2011-12, we get an inverted Clayton, which means there's upper tail dependence, and this thing here is a upper tail dependence parameter. It varies between 0 and 1, so it's like a correlation. It tells you how strong that upper tail dependence is. And you can see that in 2011-12, we're starting to see that they're starting to have some stronger correlation between the highly ranked wines by both Parker and Neil Martin. The right bank is what we're interested in, because that's typically where Parker had bigger influence. And an interesting thing happens, 2010, 11, 12. Yes, overall, the data, there's some upper tail dependence, but when you look at going from 2010 to 2011, 12, that upper tail dependence starts disappearing. So it's almost as if Neil Martin is, developing his own taste and palate around the left bank wines. So it's not that consistent upper tail dependence with Parker. So that's the problem. Did Martin start to develop his own idiosyncratic preferences in terms of Bordeaux wines, and particularly highly ranked the right bank wines? And then, of course, that adds risk for producers if Neil Martin was going to be the handoff from Parker, because they've patterned their wines after Parker. So that result with Neil Martin and Parker was before we had those results in the paper that we presented a couple of years ago, and it was before, of course, Neil Martin stepped away from the wine advocate. So now we have it's wide open. And so we do have a number of different wine raters, critics, that rate the en primeur wines. And these are the primary ones. The Decanter Wine Magazine, Rene Gabriel, James Suckling, I'm going to talk a lot about, Jancis Robinson, Jane Anson. and etc. Now, some of these, the double-starred ones, they do not appear to continue to rate the en primeur wines, or very inconsistently. So we're particularly after the ones with the single asterisks. And they have different rating scales. Not a problem for Copulas function model. The fact that they have different rating scales, that's not an issue, because Escobar's work showed that's independent of that Copulas function that we're looking at. So here's the number of, and you can see that the right bank has been the focus of more wine raters. These are the number of wines jointly rated by various wine raters and Robert Parker from the period of 2005 to 2012. Remember, 2010-12, Neil Martin came into that picture. So we want to take a look at that data, and we're going to concentrate on the right bank, and we're going to concentrate on primarily on these ones with the single asterisks. And so that's what we did. And the first thing we did is said, let's look at the 2010-12 period that we just looked at that related Neil Martin to Parker's ratings. And we said, you know, but in the right bank over that time period, there was something happening with Neil Martin's ratings, the lack of upper tail dependence. So this is the aggregate data. And the story, when we look at it, is that the decanter, pretty high rank correlation and upper tail dependence, but clearly James Suckling comes out with the highest correlation, and in particular, that higher upper tail dependence. You know, that when Parker's rating high, there's a higher correlation between James Suckling's ratings and others. Jane Anson here is another one, an interesting one to note at this point. You can see that she has low correlation with Parker's ratings and low upper tail dependence. And the reason I point that out is because although the Decanter magazine was, over that time period, if you said who was next closest to Parker after James Suckling, it would have been the Decanter. But the Decanter has handed over the ratings now of the Bordeaux Opinion wines to Jane Anson. So they kind of drop out of the picture because she has now become the wine rater for the Decanter magazine. We can take a look at James Suckling and Robert Parker over that 2010. Now, 2011, he did not rate the wines, but over 2010 to 2012, although there was a drop in correlation, there's still the upper tail dependence that is not the case with Martin. So again, if you're thinking who is the natural heir, it's appearing to be James Suckling. It's coming out on top. We can also look at that period of 2005 to 2009 for the 10, 11, 12 period, and look again at what is the best fitting copula that matches these transformed data. So we're taking care of different rating scales. That's all handled in this analysis. And again, we can see that James Suckling, high rank correlation and also high upper tail dependence. Again, the Decanter, you could say second to that, but the Decanter now is their ratings are done by Jane Anson, which has a lower correlation and lower tail dependence over that time period as well. So our results would indicate that the prominent en primeur wine critic, the ratings of James Suckling, is the highest association in terms of rank correlation, as well as the upper tail dependence with that of Parker. Decanters are high, but Jane Anson has now taken over those ratings, and hers are have a relatively low connection to Parker's. Lisa Perotti Brown, the editor-in-chief for the Wine Advocate, after Neil Martin leaving, she was announced by Parker to take the lead on the Bordeaux and Primeur wines, and she did rate the 2017 Primeur vintage in the spring of 2018. There's a suggestion in this article that came out in December that her ratings are close to that of Neil Martin. And luckily this morning I decided I better run that and find out if that's true. And so here's the connection of how does her ratings compare to Neil Martin. And again, there's tail dependence, pretty high rank correlation. How does she compare to James Suckling? And you notice that the rank correlation is low. So it is true that her ratings are closer to Neil Martin's than they are to James Suckling. So that sort of still leaves James Suckling as the lead going into this coming year as the potential heir for Parker. Let me just talk about where we're going next after this. This has been sort of a fun study for us to look at the ratings, and it's an innovative technique that's not been used by anybody else, and it's been an issue in the literature for some time. We're probably going to turn back to our use of copula functions around weather derivatives, and that has been a focus in agriculture for a bit of time now, and this is certainly not a complete list of the use of copula function modeling to connect or get a fuller understanding of the connection between weather variables and agricultural output or agricultural quality as well. And within the wine industry focus, the only paper that is out there is a paper that we looked at, some work I did in 2013 with some researchers from Sonoma State. And we looked at copula function pricing weather contracts. We were looking at the relationship of Euglin's index, heat index, to wine production and quality prices in the California wine industry. The result wasn't that good in the sense that most of the results said it was a Gaussian copula. But the problem is that we were looking at how high heat increased the sugar content on the grapes. But in California, there's an interesting thing. They add water. So when you have a high heat and your grapes are getting to the point of really high sugar content, when they go in there, they just add water. You know, something that we are not allowed to do. So they manage the sugar content, and consequently, we did not see the tail dependence in that data between how high the sugar content was with heat in the measurement of the grapes as they came up. We've done some work in copula functions and weather in the Niagara region. Our first work was to do with ice wine production back in 2007. That paper is actually posted on the Weather Risk Management Association website. So that's an association of insurance companies that deal in weather risk management and weather derivative contracts to hedge various things, various aspects of weather risk. And we've looked at a number of these different issues for our region here. But we had not used the copula function technology. Weather derivatives expanded in use for a little while, and then they kind of died off. And our next work is looking at the issues around weather derivatives, why they have not caught on, particularly in the viticulture industry. There's been a number of studies looking at their potential use. There's a variety of different risk factors that occur using these things to hedge weather risk. But at the same time, with the increasing volatility of climate change, and as you know, the biggest factor for climate change is increasing volatility. And of course, we've seen that over the past few years. And our own studies in the Niagara region show that the amount of volatility after 1993, was quite substantial. And so that creates a whole bunch of weather-related risks that affect viticulture. Harvest rainfall risk, a paper we did in the Journal of Wine Research. We've looked at winter injury, we've looked at spring frost and summer heat, etc. And but now with this Copula function modeling, that gives us a much better idea of what should be the appropriate price for such contracts, and what is the non-linear relationship between different weather variables and viticulture harvest. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Don. Do we have any questions from the audience here before we move online to answer online questions? Does anybody have any questions for Don?
I can pull up the square math equations if anybody wants to.
That'd be a no then. Anybody else? Do we have any questions online at the moment? No? Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to thank Don, and there's something from us at CCOVI for that. And there's a lot of information there, so I'm sure if anybody has any questions, they can approach Don at another time. I also want to bring your attention to next week, because our lecture series starts at 2, goes back to 2 p.m, and we will be welcoming CCOVI Fellow Ronald Jackson, who's the wine writer and author, and he'll be here next week at 2 p.m, and his lecture will be all about carbonic maceration. So I hope you enjoyed today, and thank you for viewing, all of you online, and we'll see you next week.